Someone with me today that I want to introduce to you all. Her name is Sandra Sosa. She is also with the W. Haywood Burns Institute, and she's going to be co-facilitating with me today, and I wanted to give her a few moments to introduce herself briefly before we get started. So, Sandra, hopefully I'm not putting you too much on the spot, but tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you do.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes, Cuaritonali. My name is Sandra Sosa, and I'm happy to be here and hopeful in offering any insight, knowledge, further educational sharing in this community. I am in Chicago, so born and raised here in Chicago, first generation here. Parents are from Mexico. And my background is really rooted in youth development practitioner and restorative justice rites of passage work. So I really try to connect my own childhood, teen experiences of living in a community that is under-resourced, targeted, and applying it to a lens of equity and really using that to inform my approach in as we do this work of racial justice. So with the Burns Institute, one of my capacities is working with communities, really helping communities come to the table. Not that I'm helping them to do it, but creating a space and understanding that communities are very much just as important to be at the table to discuss solutions to the issues that they are deeply affected by. And so that's one of those is we work with the Mississippi Band Choctaw Indians, working with communities in our Community Justice Network for Youth, which is we work with over 200 organizations across the country that are all working towards juvenile justice in very different ways. So a little bit about myself. Again, hopefully I can contribute something to this learning space.
Thank you. So before we get started, I will just remind everyone that we do intend for this to be a discussion. That is to say, feel free to join in. There are certainly going to be, there's a part coming up right here at the beginning where we're going to ask people to jump in. But if at any point you have any questions or you see something on a slide or we refer to something that you know something about that you think is interesting or that you would like to share, or if you have a question that you want to ask, feel free to do that. On Zoom, it is maybe a little awkward for participants, but it's a lot easier as a facilitator if you guys unmute and jump in, right? If you put something in the chat, then usually somebody has to stop the flow of conversation to try to read that. Certainly, we will try our best to man that if that's the most comfortable or most accessible way for you to communicate, but you don't have to communicate via chat. You can also jump in if you have a question or if we need to stop somewhere. So feel free to be as interactive as you all feel comfortable to be while we go through the history today. And I will remind folks again that in particular in the third session, what we're going to try to do is have some time, not just for questions and interaction like we did at the end of the first session, but we're also going to want to get a little bit of local history from you guys, right? So as we're talking about the history of structural racism in various systems throughout the history of the country, it's also important to talk about the history of structural racism in Pima County, right? What has that been? What have the impacts of that been? What has the legacy of that been? And how do we need to think about or acknowledge those things in order to disrupt those patterns and move toward a place of equity for everyone, right? Which is what this is all about. So hoping that you guys will all stick around for session 3, right? Next Wednesday. Hopefully it's about the same size and I haven't scared you guys away from that conversation. But we'll be looking forward to hearing specifically from you all about your perspectives on what your local history is. Without further ado, I will get us started here. Kind of step on my slides a little bit. Wow, look at that transition. All right. So as I said, historical competency is sort of what we're trying to get to here, understanding the creation of America, its justice system, as well as other systems. And also, I think the creation of narratives and concepts that are born out in the practices, right, of those systems. So before we do that, just in case this is your first time, again, the W. Hayward Burns Institute, Black-led national nonprofit based in Oakland, California, a diverse team of bold visionaries working to transform the administration of justice and to dismantle structural racism in local justice systems. And we've been doing that for over 20 years across all 50 states, some 300 local jurisdictions, as well as you see at least 3 First Nations tribal communities as well. And these are the various aspects of our work and sort of what they look like. Won't go too deeply into that this time, just sort of laying a bit of foundation. All right, so again, why is it important to talk about history? Obviously, if you don't know where you've been, right? If you don't know what the mistakes have been or the lessons that linger in the past through history, then you are condemned to repeat them. Said differently, there are a series of decisions and practices and concepts and intentions, right, that create the present day situations and outcomes that impact communities of color. Now, narratives may suggest that, you know, this is just the way that, you know, folks of color live, the way that they behave, what they deserve, so on and so forth. But what we actually know is that there is a series of hostile attitudes and actions toward people of color that greatly limit what their lives, what our lives can become, what opportunities are available to us, what resources are available to us, and that impacts the way that our lives take shape. And it's important to, again, understand what those patterns have been, to disrupt and dismantle those patterns, to acknowledge the harm that has been done, and to understand that for many of you who may be representing various human services systems, you've inherited a lot of stuff, including what may seem to be innocuous practices, policies, habits, perspectives that actually are steeped in some level of historical harm and impact that we need to unpack and acknowledge if we're going to move into a better place for everyone, right? So it's important to understand what that harm has been, what those patterns have been, so that you can create the necessary changes and really think about how you're approaching whatever your perspective is as an office or as an agency, so that you are beginning to undo some of that harm and to move toward a place of healing, right? So that's why we take the time, even, you know, potentially 2 sessions out of a 4-session training series, to really take our time with, you know, various points throughout history, to show that there's been, you know, some very intentional and patterned activity over time that creates the present day scenario. And that also very important to understand it's going to take, a significant amount of time, effort, energy, and intentionality to break this, right? So, we may get discouraged when we're trying all we can, or we're doing, the things that we know to do or working towards certain initiatives or efforts or objectives, and we're not seeing much of a change, right? We've been at this for a year now and nothing has changed, or we've been doing this, or we've been having the same conversation for several months and nothing is different. But we have to understand that there's an entire system or entire history spanning hundreds of years of patterned, systemic, intentional behavior that we're up against. And so it's going to take a sustained and intentional effort to create that equity that we know that we need among all of our communities of color. So with that, I think I can turn it over to Sandra to get us started.
All right, thank you, Chris. Are we? So what, very lightly, we like to share what we would desire out of, and hopefully, for your learning, is just to have more understanding around the history of structural racism in the development of youth and adult serving systems. We feel like the information that we'll share will provide perspective and sometimes enlightenment for things we were not aware of or really didn't pay attention to in terms of how baked in structural racism is in the history of this country. So being able to come out of this with some insights, gain knowledge, and different thinking, right, around what is racial equity work, how do we move that work forward in the systems that impact our children, our adults, and their families. And so really, we find really important to point out that when we're talking about structural racism, we're talking about history. We're talking about going back, digging deep, and really picking apart some things that many times we've just been socialized to accept as part of history, as part of our culture, as part of things that things that we see every day and don't really think about what is the impact of that. And so as we begin this, we would like to take a moment to give land acknowledgement, knowing that the first thing we woke up when we woke up today was to step on stolen land that was built, that this country was built on by people that were stolen from their land. And so maybe if you could drop in the chat wherever you are or whatever you may know about where you are, some acknowledgement for that land. And here, talking to you from Chicago, I am coming to you from the land of the Potawatomi, and always learning where people are from, how people are connected. And so go ahead and drop in the chat your own land acknowledgements about where you think, where you know that you're from, or what land are you standing on, or yeah.
Thank you, Sandra. And I'll just add that I'm in Oakland, California. That land belonged to the Ohlone people. Are folks familiar in Pima County with the Native or Indigenous nations whose land was, who originally lived on and inhabited the land that makes up Pima County now?
I'll go first. So go ahead and feel free to put that in there. Thank you so much. This is really important. This is a really important practice as a community and as people that are acknowledging structural racism and working to dismantle it, is to understand where people are from and what how that history plays into who we are. And so just, putting it out there. So this year we have a picture of a depiction of a monument or a structure that we have been socialized to acknowledge as a monument, is a very important monument. But if we look further into what the history of something like this means, as we think about original founding fathers, we're looking at a structure that was built on land, which is known to be the sacred Black Hills of the Lakota in South Dakota, and really just a rogue action of carving the faces of 4 former presidents of this country into land that was sacred to these people. To this day, the United States continues to try and offer money for the purchase of this land, to the Lakota people, which to this day, they will not accept. And so important to note, when we think about those things, and we're thinking about what is structural racism, literally it means like the structures that have been created that oppress and suppress and mask racial tendencies, actions, practices, etc. So that's what we're thinking about. Oops. All right.
Just noticed there was a text box, just misplaced text box right in the middle of the picture.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I was like, okay. So having historical competence, historical humility, however we want to name it, really allows us to look at how politics and practices impact communities differently. That what me being somebody that was born here, my parents are from Mexico, whatever affects me is not going to affect maybe somebody like Chris the same, or other folks in this room. And so we have to acknowledge what are those differences? How are we all affected differently? And not think that what's good for one is good for all, because that's basically what we are trying to dismantle. Next slide, please. So what is the name of the continent we are on, right? We want to think about, so what is that? Do we really acknowledge the history of that? How do we acknowledge it? How do we discuss it? How have we learned about it? So what's the name of the continent that we're on? And this is, just turn off your mic and shout it out or put in the chat.
United States of America. Or sorry, continent, North America. It's been a while since I've done geometry or geography, not geometry.
All right, couple votes for North America. Okay, yeah, I mean, we're talking about a continent, and many times what first comes to mind is the name of the specific country that we live in. But this continent is inclusive of other countries as well. So another thing, actually that's a happy mistake, as Bob Ross would say, happy mistake, because it really brings to light how we zoom in on just what we think is the reality for others, but is not. Next slide, please. So we're going to go into kind of a high point of the history here. Nothing, we know that there could be plenty of time to really have some deeper discussion, but we just really want to make sure we hit some high points here. And just for the purpose of understanding the complexity, this piece, every time whatever we share, we know that while what we're talking about is maybe specifically Native Americans in this piece, we know that during this time, there were other things, other communities being impacted by policies, changes, all of the things that were going on. So we want to make sure that nothing was happening in a vacuum, but we are highlighting what was happening, particularly to Native Americans. I think there's a question. Celso Villegas?
Yeah, hold on, can you see me?
I can see you now.
Okay, so yes, my name is Celso Villegas. I'm Tono Autumn. So this is the land that you guys that we're on. I mean, this is where we are. This is where I'm at. Pascuayaki, our brothers, they came in later because they were chased out of Rio Yaqui from Mexico, and by the Mexican government, actually by a lot of other tribes as well. So they found a place here. They have a very small reservation next to one of our Sanavir district, which is one of our 11 districts that we have. The Tohono O'odham Nation is about the size of Connecticut. I think we're the second largest in the nation. On the other, that's what we call O'odham. Every tribe, over 500 tribes, has a different name for the continent, the country, continent where we stand, where we live. Know that some people talk about the Turtle Mountain. Other tribes have their own names, but the Tohono O'odham, we call it Jiwatkacha, Mother Earth, because we didn't know about the other continents because we migrated here. And so when we talk about our place in time and space, it's Mother Earth, the Jiwatkacha. That's how we address her. And we're not too concerned about the political boundaries of the continents because that doesn't belong to us. We're not from those areas, although we acknowledge that the Earth, the entire Earth, Mother Earth, is where our Obs. You guys are Obs. I'm O'odham. That means the people. You guys are Obs. If you live in Tucson and you came here, we call you Obs. That means the other ones, because we acknowledge that human beings, there are other human beings on Earth. Anyway, I just wanted to give you that little history on here, on Tucson, Arizona. Pima County.
Thank you for that. Absolutely, thank you. Anytime you need to interrupt and drop some knowledge, we welcome that. Appreciate that because it helps all of us to learn. Gracias.
Thank you.
So moving forward with that in mind, with that context in mind, and just giving us some history that we don't even have on here. So that was a gift. We're talking about North America, right, as the language that we've learned of English, but across the continents, right, and across depending on where you are on any of these continents, from north to south of the Americas, we have various names, all meaning very different things, very beautiful things to acknowledge the land that people live on. So you have things like Earth as Turtle Island, as Celso mentioned. You have Hanuna or Cuscatlan. Cuscatlan is from the language, one of the native languages of El Salvador, and it translates into land of precious jewels. You have continent of life in Abya. You have Unchimaca. You have Pachamama in Quechua, a language of the Incas. So you have all this historical language describing the relevance and the importance of the physical land, and that is how it was referred to, and it was here before. Why is this important? Well, when you hear things, really harmful things that are said, and we like to bring to light, I don't want to pay too much attention to this, but things that are said, like last year in May, I think it was a political commentator, was on a show with Chris Cuomo, and he was talking about how there isn't much Native American culture in American culture, and quote unquote, we birthed the nation from nothing. I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, there isn't much Native American culture in American culture. And he was dropped from CNN. But when you hear those things, and let's be real, these are things that we hear all the time. People of color, we're like radars when we hear things like that, and we say, you know what, that leaves me out of the equation. Where am I in that? Why is that dismissive? Why is that not inclusive? And those comments are really like made to leave people out, because as long as we don't know that all of these languages and these people across North to South America, all the countries in between, all the tribes in between, before they were countries, had their own relationship and relevance to this land, this physical land. And so the original people here, there were people long before anything was built. And again, a lot of those things were built because people were forced to build them for others. It's important to acknowledge. It's important to acknowledge who we are in the room. How are we connected to that history, even if it means that our ancestors participated in creating some of that harm? It is important to acknowledge that, because that's how we can be transparent with community when we're talking about structural racism. Next slide. So here we have, this number could probably change, but when we're thinking about what is genocide, what is the erasure of a people, right? And it doesn't just happen in one swooping action. It happens in a structural, systemic series of actions to create genocide from people, not allowing people to practice their ceremonies, their language, the way they dress, the way they wear their hair, etc. But how many, if we're thinking about what that genocide looked like, how many Indigenous people actually lived on Turtle Island before the invasion of the Europeans, right? How many people were there? And to this day, they still, the numbers still shift a little, but there's a good median number between 80 to 112 million people. So for somebody to say there was nothing here is a outright statement of erasure, right? Of racism, to erase the knowledge of anybody being here. So population before genocide, 80 to 112 million. Then we have, right, all of this map is really depicting these, if you could see further, like clearly, if we had to zoom in, these are the tribes that existed across the continent, or maybe even a snippet. Maybe it doesn't even capture all of them. Yes, that was Rick Santorum. So it was, imagine all of these tribes already existing here, already building here, having created their civilizations, created systems of livelihood, etc. This is how it was populated, right? So to not acknowledge that there's a history of people here, a history of cultures and practices, diverse cultures and practices, all throughout the continent, is how we've been socialized to think very narrowly. And that is how we feel like structural racism is built on making sure that those things are not part of our socialization. So with what we know is there's again a diverse structures of pre-European society, classless, communitarian, matriarchal. Elders were revered for wisdom. We know in many tribal communities, what some folks might refer to as two-spirit, what we think of today as the LGBTQ, but in tribal communities is actually a place in your community that is looked at in a very respectful or purposeful way. No one is thrown away. There are no concepts that have been documented where prisons exist. Indigenous people were established in like resolving community problems. And if you look into the history of like restorative justice, I can't think for the top of my head, the one law that basically wasn't too long ago, I think it was 1978, where indigenous people were allowed to practice their own forms of government, whereas before it was taken away. And now we have restorative justice practices all running around the justice system as if it was the idea of the justice system. But no, it came from indigenous communities that had their own way of resolving issues, no matter how severe they handled it. And so thinking about like how those structures were interrupted by structural racism, how those civilizations were influenced by structural racism to change their entire way of being, right, to adapt to what we now call the United States of America. Next slide, please.
Before we move on, I figured there might be a hand there. I was looking to see if there was any input in terms of what pre-European society looked like.
This is also again, the estimates about 80 to 112 million. There's several articles, and that's true. It's about that before European intrusion. But the 2020 census numbers us at 10 million, at about 10.2 million. So we're making a recovery from the census that was taken in 1960. So we're gradually and slowly, coming back. But 10 million Native Americans is not a lot. 10 million Native Americans can fit in the size of New York City. That's who we are. But on the other point about what we do, how our culture was set up before the white conquest, the European conquest. Most of our cultures, different native groups across America, have a hard time. When we think about history, we think about that in the 1970s and 80s, it was a genocide. So we're still trying to recover back our tradition and customs and stories that were somehow taken away from us, because that is the purpose of a conquest, is to take away all that and assimilate you into the group, sort of what Russia's doing to Ukraine. So that's an actual example of genocide. But anyway, so we're recovering, we're bringing back our culture, our language, our Hempduck. For us, that's what we call our culture. That's who we are. That's how we're defined. So we're catching up. So I would say we're about almost 50 to 100 years behind. We're just trying to catch up because we were stopped in our social and economical and just our philosophical, just like everybody else, we just got conquered and it stopped. So what I say to people when they ask me, well, how were the Occams like, 5,000, 4,000 years ago? And I have to be honest and say, I don't know. but I do know through our language and our hemp talk what we used to do. And so, yeah, we were just, so if people say, like I see pictures of how people, the archaeologists and anthropologists depict us, and I'm going, well, I don't know if anybody wasn't, they weren't there either. So, so it's up in the air. But what I tell people, it doesn't matter. We're here now. We're still here. So we go from here. And we're just a subculture from the real culture, from the big culture, from the dominant society. Thought I'd just throw that in because it comes up a lot when we have these discussions on Native groups. And one thing, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Celso Villegas. I'm the Director of Water Resources for the Tohono O'odham Nation. That's my people. As far as education, I have a bachelor's, master's, and a PhD in science. I'm science-based. So I do a lot of reading just to keep me going. And I think, Christopher, I think I met you at something at the Tucson Community Center. There was an activity going on with the Safety Justice Challenge there was a big event going on there. I think we're talking to one of the old politicians. I can't think of his name. It's a Mexican politician. And I think that's where I saw you. I may not, but you look very familiar. But I was there because I used to be in the Safety Justice Challenge, and when I was talking to Judge Pyle, he was there, and can't think. Anyway, so you look very familiar, or maybe not. Sometimes the human beings try to find us, people that they think they know. So sorry about that if you don't remember, but. Anyway, I thought I'd bring that in because we're not out of the game yet. We're still trying to recover from historical trauma. So thank you.
Thank you, Celso, for sharing. What an excellent point. Yeah, first of all, these pictures, well, I don't know. Yeah, we don't know who gets them. Hopefully they're depicted from stories that people have shared, right? About what may our previous societies here have looked like. But important to say is that we focus so much on how was it like before? Well, we forget, well, what's it like now? For Native people now, what's their reality at this time? Never mind what has been, but what is it now? And what are we doing now to support Native people in the reality of now having experienced what Celso just described? So thank you for that, Celso. And you are welcome to interrupt and interject anytime when you drop some knowledge. So thank you. Next slide, please. So just moving forward, we've seen these maps. These are, we know the naming of this continent. It comes after Amerigo Vespucci, right? And this a map creating how basically the land was picked apart after what is acknowledged as the European invasion. So, taking a look at how this all came, how this has all been picked apart. What was the United States? How was everything else? Lots of stories to share here. Not enough time on this day, but definitely lots of conversation to have here, and can be painful. Sorry, Chris, go ahead. So, with acknowledging how just, again, if we were to only be looking at a brief depiction of just a little window of how Native Americans have been impacted by structural racism as in the rise of the United States territory. We have the philosophy, the ideology, the mental models that have supported that rise by using language like the Indian problem, manifest destiny, policies that have supported those mental models, such as the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, appropriations, DAWs, all of these, the Carlisle Indian School, which there's still uncovering those remains, those sacred remains of those people that have that suffered through those times. So, you know, not wanting to pursue or create more pain, but acknowledging that those things happened, and they happened in a way that was created, that was formed, that was sequenced and followed up, encouraged with policy, words, thinking, policy, words, thinking, and just constant layering of all those things to create this othering of the Indian problem, manifest destiny, and basically resulting in how we see Native people today. Again, another bit of a timeline of some historical highlights. Obviously, if we, you know, these are the overall, right, the bigger policies, but I'm sure we could zoom into any one of these locally and see what are some smaller things that happened along the way to impact these communities. So starting with Oklahoma, becoming a state, more Indian lands taken. I think recently there was a law that passed that returned some of that land to the people there. Yeah, so moving up this timeline, just acknowledging how Native people have been impacted by the structural racism of laws, of policies, of mental models, thinking, etc. And with that, we move into, not so lightly, but at this juncture, we move into, I know it's so hard, we move into another phase of looking at structural racism. I'm gonna turn it over to Chris.
All right, thank you. I will, as I start here, just warn everyone that some of the images that you may see might be a little bit troubling. These are, we certainly don't intend to trigger people or make people uncomfortable, but the fact of the matter is something that we're having trouble acknowledging in this country at large right now is that plenty of our history is troubling. Plenty of our history is uncomfortable. Plenty of our history is traumatic, and that people are still generationally, so many generations later, still feeling the impacts of that trauma, still feeling the impacts of that discrimination, that limiting on their lives and the circumstances and dynamics surrounding it. So that's why we want to shed light on what that history has been. Right on. So for enslavement and Jim Crow, and we start talking about sort of the history of the Black experience, so much of that, as far as this country is concerned, begins with the transatlantic slave trade. That's various European countries and or colonies taking people from particularly the western coast of Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to various other colonies throughout the Americas, right? And obviously what we know about that is that it was a very dehumanizing system of transport, in a very dehumanizing system of commerce, right? That led to that particular slave trade, that led to the way that people were treated as if they were property, much like cattle, bought, sold, not seen as having rights, not seen as being particularly worthy of any sort of ethical or empathic or empathetic treatment, and how that shaped the relationship that Black people would have to the establishment and the development of the country in the generations to come. So there's the timeline here, and I will stop along the way of this timeline a little bit sometimes to give a little bit more context or just to tease out some of these details, right? So your first slave ship docks in Jamestown in 1619. And in 1705, you have your slave codes established, which limit the ability of people who were enslaved to be in certain places, to have certain things, to read, to write, so on and so forth. Slave patrols are established in every slave state to enforce these rules and also to make sure, that slaves are not running away. So as you move to 1793, you have a Fugitive Slave Act, which just further professionalizes this idea of patrolling to be able to round up slaves who are running away for their freedom. And I'm going to stop in 1857, right? Because this idea of slaves running away and what rights they had, or folks trying to bring them back to the plantations that they had left, sort of culminates in this landmark Supreme Court case, widely regarded as the worst ever Supreme Court decision, although I'm sure it has competition. And that was the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a man who was enslaved and put himself in a box, made sure that he, poked holes in it to be able to breathe, shipped himself across the boundary between free and slave states that literally existed, like a sort of a latitudinal boundary, crosses that boundary and believes himself to be free now that he has crossed into that territory. He was promptly found, and the attempt was to take him back to his plantation, or the plantation that he had left, and he sued for his freedom, and the case was heard in the Supreme Court. The reason I would point this out to you is because in the decision, right, part of the language that was used in the decision that denied Dred Scott his freedom, right, sent him back to slavery after all that, said that Black people had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. And the reason that I would point that out to you is because, it's a point in history where the Supreme Court or some other systemic and national and heralded institution, right, of this country essentially says the quiet part out loud, right? Slaves are coming to Jamestown because Black people have no rights, essentially, that white people are bound to respect, right? Slave codes and slave patrols, same thing. Fugitive Slave Act, same thing, but without the force of the highest court of the land, right? Sort of ratifying that or calling it out. And here you have a decision that would obviously become, again, it was something that became known to be one of the worst decisions ever out of the Supreme Court. But the concept, right, that Black people did not have rights that needed to be respected by establishments or by the dominant culture would continue, right? It existed before this decision and would continue and continues in many ways to this day. And so I think it's worth pointing out how real that concept was, that it even was reflected in, case law at the Supreme Court level. So moving forward, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. Essentially, this, leads to Southern states seceding from the Civil War shortly after, and ultimately, in order to attempt to bring the war to an end, you have an Emancipation Proclamation which frees the slaves. All right, so here I'm going to stop a few places again, right, just to make sure that we understand sort of the context and the legacy of some of this information. So this timeline is about Reconstruction, Jim Crow, criminalization. So the 13th Amendment in 1865 abolishes slavery. As I'm sure most of you know, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery with a caveat. Does anybody know what that caveat is? I'm sure you do. Feel free to shout it out or put it in the chat. Prison, right? Or essentially, but for as punishment for a crime, right? So slavery is abolished, but for punishment for a crime. And essentially what that means, now mind you, when slavery is abolished and when there's the Emancipation Proclamation in particular, right? Slave owners are given reparations for that, right? And there's an entire economy, particularly in the American South, that is dependent on that unpaid labor, that free labor to do the work, the agricultural work that that rules the Southern economy. So in 1865, when slavery is abolished, but for this caveat, right, it creates a loophole essentially that makes the Southern economy a lot more viable again. And the legacy of that is, right, that all we have to do, right, is to criminalize Black behavior and we can essentially have slavery all over again. And so that leads directly to what is known as convict leasing, right, which many people would say it was worse in some ways than slavery, just because on some level, if you're a slave owner, you need the people who work for you to survive. You need them to have their basic needs met in a way that means that they will continue to live and be able to work. Whereas if we're talking about convict leasing, we're talking about people who have been jailed and who are now forced to work. If something happens to them, if they don't survive, you can essentially replace that labor by making a new arrest, right? And so the conditions that people had to suffer as they were being forced to do this work were different in certain ways, because the preservation of the lives of those working was not what it had been even on a plantation. Somebody shared they relocated freedmen to the criminal system to provide unpaid labor to rebuild the South. Right, exactly. So as this is all coming together, you have Reconstruction, where federal government reincorporating Southern states and attempting to provide freed Black people rights, meaning you had federal troops in Southern states to ensure that Black people had the right to vote and to go to school and to use certain public facilities and so on and so forth. And so during this time, you see many of your first Black elected officials, right, such as mayors and even congressmen and senators, coming out of Southern states, because Black people are protected in their ability to vote, as well as to run for office, to run businesses, so on and so forth. And they begin to thrive with this protection that, this force of troops who are going to make sure that they're safe as they go about sort of living their lives and fulfilling their own ambitions. The Compromise of 1877 ends Reconstruction, right? So federal troops withdraw from the South. And this is important to point out, because if essentially you know that in order for a group of people to actually live the freedoms that America promises to all of its citizens, there needs to be these troops, right, in place to ensure that these things happen, right, and to make sure that that people are safe and protected, that Black folks are safe and protected in the South. Then what do you think is going to happen when you abruptly all go home, right? it led to the end of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, right, taking over immediately, right? So you had a lot of business owners who would have to forfeit their businesses and leave town immediately in order to be safe. You had, most, if not all, of your elected officials, particularly those congressmen and senators, are, also upended or uprooted from their offices, never to hold that level of office again. So that's what it looked like in the South after Reconstruction. And as you move forward, Jim Crow being the law of the land, that had a huge impact on what the trajectory of life could be for Black people in the South, even after a 12-year period of thriving, a 12-year period of increase, in a 12-year period of freedom. So Jim Crow flourishes, as Reconstruction ends. Thousands of lynchings, even more thousands dying in convict leasing, because again, remember, the goal it's no longer necessary to preserve the lives of the people who are working. As Jim Crow continues to segregate public spaces and the military, Plessy versus Ferguson, another Supreme Court case, I'm guessing you guys can tell I went to law school, makes separate but equal the law of the land, right? But separate but equal, the issue with that is, of course, it never existed. So we said separate but equal, but what actually existed were various, it's searing differences between the quality of life in Black communities and white communities, right? In schools, facilities, libraries, which may not have always existed for Black people, so on and so forth, as well as, just sort of obvious hiring practices, right, that sought to discriminate as well. This leads to a great migration, 6 million Black folks moving out of the South to avoid the terror of white supremacy, but finding, various other forms of discrimination in the places that they would go to, particularly in industrialized towns with redlining and so on and so forth, limiting where they could live, limiting the kind of education or educational opportunities made available, so on and so forth. So moving forward, civil rights movement, Black power, drug war. Really quick, actually, before I move on to that, I will just say, last thing on convict leasing and criminalization, just that the legacy of that was, the criminalization of Black behavior, right? Because there's your loophole for essentially remaking slavery, but also outsized sentencing, right, for things that Black people, in particular Black men at the time, were convicted of, right? So, a relatively minor offense could lead to a significant amount of time spent doing labor for the state, because the objective really was to sort of recreate or remake slavery, which had been outlawed, but for this specific exception. So as you move on through history, what you see as you get your civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and drug war is Brown versus Board ending segregation of schools, theoretically. Folks having to actually test that by showing up to schools that they had been segregated out of, right? You see COINTELPRO, the FBI surveillance of Black organizations, as well as other organizations and social movements. Voting Rights Act in '64 gives Blacks the right to vote. And what's interesting about all of this, and we sort of tackle this in the slides to come, something that I think a lot of times we don't think about, when these acts and these bills and these laws get passed, right? You know, the way this is worded, it says the Voting Rights Act gave Blacks the right to vote, right? And that's right, because for other groups, right, like the Latinx community, like some, you know, the Asian American community, some of these questions were considered separate and needed to be settled by law again, despite the fact that, you know, there was at least some precedent, if not all of the precedent, you know, that would be needed right here in, you know, in these things. You would think, you know, Indian segregation of schools by way of Brown versus Board would have meant not just for Black people, but for every other racial or ethnic group, and it did not, right? Those things had to actually be settled in court as well, because people were still being discriminated against, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. 1971, you see the war on drugs. So basically, this is again criminalization of certain activities associated with communities of color in order to continue to incarcerate. And so you see an explosion, right, from 1970 to the present, of mass incarceration and of the number of people, right, who make up, especially the number of Black and brown people who make up the incarcerated population. Okay. So what you see from there, 96, marijuana legalization debate begins. Legalization versus decriminalization begins. And now, you know, in various states, marijuana is very legal. But so many of the people who were jailed or convicted or imprisoned for the use or the sale of it have nothing to show for the profits that are now being made in a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? In addition to that, you know, as we've made, you know, our strides forward, you still see, you know, these high-profile cases of state violence against people of color in general, certainly Black people, especially Black men, and the verdicts of those cases, if they even, you know, go to court for some level of accountability as well. And that's important to point out, because the legacy of that sort of concept starts with lynchings, right? If you look at the history of lynchings, in a lot of those cases, there was a lack of accountability for any of the folks who might have been involved, in terms of just systemic responses, people's willingness to show up and bear witness to what they saw or experienced. And even, you know, there were even laws, have even been laws about whether or not folks of color were allowed to testify in court against white people. So that leads us to, you know, now looking at this from a different perspective, right? Looking at what the Latinx perspective or what that history has been in this country leading up to this point, right? So stolen lands, again, right? We talked about how, you know, this land was land that was taken from indigenous peoples, right? Who populated this land before Europeans got here. But indeed, also there were, you know, various treaties with, you know, with Mexico, as well as others that, you know, were not honored or led to, you know, bloody confrontations over the land in order to sort of round out the country that we now know as the USA, right? So Texas Rangers are established in 1823 to protect white landowners and enforce Juan Crow, right? So you heard of Jim Crow. Juan Crow was a set of policies and actions that were taken against Latinx people, particularly in the Southwest, right? And so, you know, I don't want to step on my on my next slide, so I would just say, as Texas is annexed to the U.S., you see the expansion of slavery to Texas, as well as disenfranchised Mexican people, right? You see the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexican people begin to lose lands and civil rights over that land. That's going to continue for years, and it's going to lead ultimately to, you know, a social movement in the area, right? Particularly led by the Chicano community, right? To reassert the right to that land, right? And something that we definitely don't talk a lot about, I haven't seen very many images like this of, but 871 documented lynchings of Mexican American people in the Southwest from 1851 to 1930, right? So while these struggles are different between the various, you know, communities of color, they have a lot of commonalities, and it's important to note not only that they have commonalities, but that there are, I think, in so many communities, there's a history of cooperation between, you know, the groups, between the racial groups, to work together to stand up to oppression, or to share resources and information with each other, and to be each other's allies. Right. So after your Texas Rangers are formed, you see in 1910, from 1910 to 1920, 5,000 Mexican Americans killed, many by Texas Rangers, right? Your Border Patrol is established in 1924, authorized to turn daily workers away, people who are coming over from Mexico to work in Texas or other parts of the Southwest United States on a daily basis. Not only were they authorized to turn them away, but the Border Patrol would often abuse or demand bribes from people who were coming over to work. So as we talked about before, well, before I get to that, I'll say, you know, the Zoot Suit riots, right? You see white sailors attacking Mexican American, Black, and Filipino youth in 1943. And then next on your timeline, 1954. So again, remember, you have Brown versus Board around the same time, but 1954's landmark case, Hernandez versus Texas, gives Mexican American people equal protection under the law. You would think, I certainly would have thought before, you know, we began to do this research as an organization, that Brown v. Board sort of settled this question, you know, for everyone, right? It was certainly the one that I was most familiar with, hadn't really heard of, even having been in law school, hadn't spent much time or had much experience with Hernandez v. Texas. But these are legal questions that had to be settled specifically for various racial groups, despite the fact that other racial groups had already established, you know, sort of a new law of the land, right? And so this leads up to sort of the present. Again, we talked about, you know, the Chicano movement is established in the 1960s, and that leads directly to the land grant movement, fighting to convince the government to honor the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? Cesar Chavez, right, leading Mexican Americans who joined with Filipinos to strike in the Delano Grape Strike, right? So again, that idea of more than one different racial or ethnic group coming together as allies to fight oppression. And in 1970, you have a case against segregation in schools. So this is well after the question of segregation in schools is settled, at least in terms of a matter of law, for Black people going to school with white people, you still needed a landmark case here to have that same legal question settled for the Latinx community. And I am going to stop right there for now, because we have about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to see if anyone has any questions. So I will stop my screen share there, and we'll pick it up there for next time. But certainly wanted to hear from you all. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts whatsoever. You know, I know it's a lot of information that we shared or that we threw at you. Would love to clarify sort of why any of this is relevant, or, you know, what the impacts of some of it may have been. So Mr. Villegas, I see that your mic is on and your screen is on. So if you wanted to start us off, I'm happy to hear from you.
Okay, Christopher, I don't want to take the show, but I think that there's some things that were going along in the history with Black Americans, and one of them was when the 1963 March on Washington. There was a lot of Native Americans attending that. A lot of people from Tucson, I think about 25, and so about 100 from Phoenix. And I didn't get to go because my mom wouldn't let me. But I'm 70 years old. I've been through that. I mean, I watched most of the civil rights movements for all races. So I have a different advantage than most people. So in 1963, the American Indian Rights Fund, which is called NARF, was patterned under the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund. And in Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait, outlined the historical injustice inflicted on Native people. And when I was in high school, and that would be in '66, I actually I saw him speak about American Indians injustices. So I had that going. But the history of Red Power in 1963, the National Indian Youth Council was formed by the University of Chicago graduate students, including friends of mine, Clyde and Della Warrior. I met them later. And they promoted education and structural well-being versus violence. In 1968, the American Indian Movement was formed, and they were formed to protect local Native people from getting beat up from the state and local police. So in 1970, I joined the American Indian Movement to do that in Tucson, because in Tucson, there was a lot of violence against Native people, against our people, against anybody that was, when attended bars, they would get drunk and then they'll call the cops and they will beat them up and take them to jail. So we formed a little group that we would jump in there and we will protect them and get beat up. And I don't know how many times I went to South Tucson court here in South Tucson. And all I was just defending these people that are getting beat up by the police. So, but I just wanted to bring, to just say that along, as we're moving, as Black Power was moving along, there was Brown Power, Red Power, and the Red Power aspect is that after Wounded Knee, where the federal officers were shot and Leonard Peltier went to prison, AIM basically broke up and we went into cells, individual cells, little groups. And we're still active. We still promote a lot of stuff. We're not actively out there like we used to because we're older, but we provide money, water, anything they need, like the, Standing Rock, we send money and food and stuff. So we're still pretty active, but we're not. A lot of us have gone to school, taking the National Indian Youth Council, their philosophy was get an education and get, be well and have a life in spite of historical trauma. And so that's the road that I took. And so that's why, I understand both sides of the story because I was on both sides at one time. But so yeah, but here in Pima County, I would say when I was growing up, I started realizing things like when I was 11 years old, there was a lot of hostility towards Native Americans and everybody, Hispanics, everybody. The Tucson police was very, very, beat up a lot of people. That's all I could see when I was young. But when I was in sixth grade at Mission View here in Tucson, one time I was walking through the neighborhood, South Tucson neighborhood, and I realized that there was not that many Indians. So I went home and I told my dad, I said, Dad, Dad, I said, you said this is our land, that this is belonged to us, and this is where we were from and all this. Who are all these other people? And why are they here? And then he told me that they took our land. And so that's when I was 11 years old. And from that day, it really caused me a lot of trouble because I couldn't believe that we were free people. And then now that I got older, I'm thinking, boy, that when I was 11 years old, I already knew that something was wrong with the system. But I just wanted to bring that up. And the last thing I wanted to say is that if you were to ask me now, how my feelings are because I went through a lot of changes. We talk about this a lot with among ourselves, like, among my friends, and we talk about. So, people call us, crazy Indians, devil dogs, redskins, I went through all the, good Indians, a dead Indian, all of that stuff, as growing up. And one of the things you never hear us talk back is that one of the things we do talk about is we call it the crazy white man syndrome. And we think that it should be listed as a mental disorder because it is something about white people, not in general. I have a lot of good friends in all cultures. I look for good people, not racist. I'm not a racist. I look for people who are good, as humans. That's who my friends are, good human beings, no matter who they are. Because I believe I'm one, and I just want everybody to get what they need in this world before they pass. But I think that white men are scared of losing their power because the shift in population structure. And I think that causes them to be really self-defensive and and all they want to do is to survive and to survive with power. It's in their vocabulary when you hear them talk. And we still have that structural racism that you talked about last time. And so the only thing to combat structural racism is to be structural well-being, is to just look at yourself and everybody, not through race, but through human eyes, and to say that I just want a better life. I just want my kids to be happy. I just want something. I want what America, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights say, that I have that freedom to pursuit of happiness and liberty. But and as far as historical trauma, I can see it. I saw it. You brought it back up, and that's a good presentation. But I tell people that at this point, I'm not concerned about historical traumas as much as trying to push a future for all of us in America, because the concept that we're enemies within a country, that everybody came here to our country, to our land, and they're still fighting. It's like, wow, where do we fit in as Native Americans? Because we fought each other historically, but it was a different way of fighting. It wasn't genocide. It was territorial. You stay on your side, but it wasn't that we're going to come to your area and kill you. And so that's why we call it the crazy white man syndrome. And it may sound derogatory, but the reason I say red skin, good Indian, a dead Indian, a red devil dog, I think, yeah, the general dominant society hasn't been nice to us either. They call us names, and when they do a lot of stuff and we just listen. we call it, we're in the belly of the beast. We're in the stomach of the beast. We hear it all the time because we hear all this stuff and we're saying to ourselves is that, well, even though we're just 10 million of us, will we be able, Native Americans, to be recognized as citizens of the United States and be partners and friends to the people here, including everybody here in America, because we don't have no place to go. This is ours. I mean, when they say go home, we're saying where is home? This is home, and not being racist or derogatory, but anybody that's here in America who is a good person, that's why we call you op. It's not a bad word. It just means that you're the other ones that are here with us. So I just wanted to bring that up because I know that probably nobody has ever heard a Indian's perspective about what is going on. I mean, because we're invisible to people. We don't have a sitcom. Nobody really talks about us. Nobody really how many Native people do you know that you really know? How many Native people do you see in Tucson? You're pretty fortunate to see Native Americans because not only all of them, there's Yaqui here and a lot of student Navajos, Hopis, because of the university, they're here. But that's what I tell people, I bet you have one or two Native American friends that you really don't know because we live on reservations and all this stuff. So it's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that there's a realization to what is really happening in this world as far as Native Americans and our presence. We've been cut off culturally in the educational system where they don't tell the real story because they can't, because they're going to say that they're racist and they killed us all. I mean, that's not a good story to say to your kids or any kid, any person. So I still believe that the United Nations Declaration of Humans, that human rights is that we all, being human, have rights to live here on Earth, on Juarcach, on the Mother Earth, because all of us don't have another home right now. Where are we going to go? So that's an interesting. So yeah, all of the stuff, historical thing you brought up the way I'm speaking, because but the best thing I wanted to tell you before I leave, before I say nothing no more, is that, so the best thing that ever happened to me in 2014, I received the Martin Luther King Award for community service. That was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. At the University of Arizona basketball game, I was a coach for Bobby Kirby High School. We went there and they presented that to me. And the reason why it has significance, because when I heard Martin Luther King speak about Native Americans, I said, that guy likes us. He's on our side. So we have things in common. All of us, we've been through historical trauma. Thank you.
Wow. Awesome. So, Chris, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that as we get ready to close out?
He ended with thank you. And I would say thank you so much for being here, for contributing to this discussion. That's what we're always looking for when we're doing this is the insight, the context that you all can bring to this, because this is all of our history, right? It is all of our responsibility, right? So yeah, while I think when you look at what's going on right now with folks trying to censor this or remove this or erase this from the larger conversation and context in schools and in workplaces, and certainly from a policy standpoint, I think it's because of what you just raised, right? People don't like, the way that, they are represented, or even, where they're placed in life right now, right? How that is related to that history, but it's all of our history. It's not just, white people that need to confront and deal with. A lot of us can internalize, a lot of, this stuff, and we need to work through that. And we all have the responsibility of building, what is new and what's going to work for everyone. So we all have to understand that. we all have been socialized in a culture that is, antagonistic to that point, and we all have to do the work of unlearning that to go boldly into a future of equity, period. So thank you so much, Celso, for contributing to the discussion. Looking forward to hearing from so many more of you when we pick this back up next week.
Awesome. Appreciate it. And really do appreciate Celso for your comments and your interjections. I will put the challenge out to the group, especially for those of you that are going to be attending next week. All of us are in different spaces, whether that be legal, behavioral health, community activism, whatever that may be. I would encourage you to take some time and maybe find out a little bit of history around Pima County, around your sector and what you do, and maybe bring some of that to the table next week when we have these discussions, so we can all learn a little bit about what's going on in Pima County in different sectors, and also discuss some of the historical attributes of it, and just have a bountiful, beautiful conversation to go on with the historical information that they're going to give us next week. So I would challenge you guys to bring that to the table and be part of the discussion. And with that, we want to thank you guys for participating. We hope to see you next week for our continuation of we have 2 more sessions next week and then the following week. Thank you for attending, and we hope to see you guys all next week. And hopefully within the next 24 to 48 hours, we will put this recording up on our Justice channel. For those of you that may have missed it, please reach out to others and have them register and come attend next week for the last 2 courses. You guys have a great one, and thank you for participating.